You've probably been told your ancestors invented fire. That's wrong. For most of human history, they couldn't make fire at all. They could only keep it. And what that actually required is stranger and far more dangerous than anything you were taught in school. Somebody in your family line had this job once. Not a title. Not something they volunteered for. Just the person awake at 3 a.m., staring at a bed of coals, deciding whether to add another branch. Get it wrong, and the fire dies before sunrise. Get it wrong, and the whole group wakes up cold, exposed, in a world that had far more teeth in it than yours does now. Here's the part that should stop you. This job existed for close to 1 million years before anyone on Earth figured out how to strike a spark from nothing. No flint kit, no matches, no trick for raising fire from friction. If the flame went out, it stayed out. Unless lightning or a passing wildfire handed your ancestors another one. So the group's entire relationship with warmth, light, and safety rested on one rule. Never let the coals go fully cold. In 2012, researcher Francesco Berna, working out of Boston University, published proof of exactly how far back this behavior goes. His team excavated Wonderwerk Cave, a site cut deep into a hillside in South Africa. They dug past where sunlight reaches, past any spot a stray wildfire could plausibly wander into on its own, and found ash. Microscopic plant ash. Burned bone fragments, sitting in sediment roughly 1 million years old. Homo sapiens didn't exist yet. This was Homo erectus. A relative, not you exactly, but close enough that the behavior still counts as part of your story. A follow-up study on that same cave, published in 2026, pushed the number even further back, to as far as 1.79 million years. Somebody carried that fire in, deep into the dark, and somebody kept it burning there, again and again, for an almost unthinkable stretch of time. Think about what that meant practically. Somebody fed it small branches through the night. Somebody carried embers, wrapped and shielded whenever the group moved camp, sometimes for days at a stretch. This wasn't a chore you could skip. It was closer to guarding the only water source for 100 miles, except this water source could vanish in an hour if you got careless. And here's a detail most people miss entirely. Fire wasn't just about warmth. You were not at the top of the food chain yet. Cave lions. Hyenas built bigger than the ones alive today. Saber-toothed cats. Plenty of things in that landscape were built specifically to eat what you were made of. At a South African site called Swartkrans, paleoanthropologist C.K. Brain found burned bone over 1 million years old, mixed in among the remains of both early hominins and large predators. Fire didn't need to injure an animal to work. Open flame makes most predators hesitate, and that hesitation was sometimes the entire difference between a group that survived the night and one that didn't. Picture what the actual watch felt like. Everyone else is down, curled in close for warmth, breathing slow. You're not fighting sleep because you're brave. You're fighting it because you're the only thing standing between a bed of dying coals and total darkness. You feed in one branch, small, not too much, and wait. Too little. The fire gutters out before it can catch. Too much, too fast, and you burn through fuel the group might need before dawn. This is a skill learned the hard way and passed down the same way most survival knowledge was passed down back then. By watching someone older do it first and being trusted eventually to do it yourself. So your ancestors were guarding something they couldn't replace against animals that could kill them in seconds. And it gets stranger. Because that same flame appears to have shaped something you use every single day. Your ability to sit down and tell a story. Before controlled fire, the day basically ended at sunset. Too dark. Too dangerous. Nothing productive left to do. Firelight changed that math completely. It stretched the day, and it created hours that had never existed before. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent decades studying the Juhoansi of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last hunter-gatherer populations whose daily rhythm still resembles what your distant ancestors might have looked like. In 2014, she published something remarkable, a direct comparison of what people talked about during the day versus what they talked about at night. Around the fire, daytime conversation was almost entirely practical. Arguments, gossip, logistics. Roughly a third of it was strictly economic. Who found food? Who owed who? Ordinary daylight business, firelight conversation flipped that completely. Over 80% of it was storytelling. Myths, memories. Tales about people the listeners had never even met, sometimes living in camps days away. Wiesner, who'd spent 40 years with these communities by the time she published the work, described something about firelight in the middle of the dark that bonds people and opens them up in a way daylight conversation simply doesn't reach. That raises a genuinely strange possibility. Storytelling, the exact thing happening right now, between this video and you, may have needed fire to exist in the first place. Not because your ancestors lacked language without it, because they lacked the stillness and the shared hours until firelight handed it to them. Think about what that actually implies. Every myth, every bedtime story, every campfire tale your species has ever told may trace back to a very practical accident. Fire bought your ancestors extra hours they didn't know what to do with at first. And storytelling is what filled the silence. Not a luxury invented later. A byproduct of survival technology, almost from the beginning. By around 400,000 years ago, at a site called Qesem Cave, also in Israel, the evidence for fire use stops looking occasional and starts looking constant. Thick ash layers. The same hearth, rebuilt in the same spot, over and over, generation after generation. Fire had stopped being a stroke of luck by then. It had become infrastructure. Something a group planned its entire camp layout around. The way you might plan a house around where the outlets are. But storytelling and social bonding weren't the only trade fire made with your body. It also rewired something far more physical. And the proof is written directly into your ancestors' skeletons. Cooked food is cheaper to run than raw food. Not cheaper to gather, cheaper to digest. Richard Wrangham, a biological anthropologist at Harvard, is the researcher most associated with this idea, usually called the cooking hypothesis. Heat breaks down muscle fiber and plant cell walls before your gut ever has to do that work itself. Less energy spent chewing and digesting means more energy left over for other things. Look at the skeletons from this period, and you can watch that trade happen in real time. Jaws shrink. Molars get smaller. Gut size drops. Which sounds minor until you learn that digestive tissue is metabolically expensive to maintain, almost as expensive, pound for pound, as brain tissue. Spend less running your gut, and suddenly there's room in the energy budget for an organ that today burns through roughly a fifth of your body's resting calories. Just sitting there thinking. Compare that to a chimpanzee, one of your closest living relatives. Chimps spend hours a day just chewing raw food, sometimes close to half their waking hours, grinding through tough plant fiber their bodies can barely extract calories from. Cooking essentially did that chewing in advance, using fire instead of teeth. That's an enormous amount of freed up time and energy, applied consistently, generation after generation. Not every researcher agrees on precisely how much weight cooking alone carries in that story. Some argue tool use and meat eating deserve equal credit. But the timing lines up closely enough with the fire evidence that it's difficult to write off as coincidence. The brain you're using to process this sentence right now may partly exist because some ancestor of yours refused to let a flame die on a cold night 1,000,000 years ago. So fire kept your ancestors warm, kept predators back, gave them stories, and possibly funded the growth of the human brain itself. And they did all of that without knowing how to actually create it. Which brings us to the twist that changes the entire timeline. For decades, the earliest solid proof of humans truly manufacturing fire, not just keeping it, came from France, dated to roughly 50,000 years ago. Researchers there identified dozens of Neanderthal hand axes with wear patterns matching repeated, forceful strikes against pyrite, the same basic technique flint and steel fire kits used for most of recorded history. Then, in late 2025, that number moved dramatically. A team led by Nick Ashton and Rob Davis at the British Museum, excavating a site called Barnham in eastern England, uncovered heat-shattered flint hand axes and a patch of clay scorched past 700 degrees Celsius, in the same exact spot repeatedly. Alongside it, they found 2 small fragments of iron pyrite. Pyrite doesn't occur naturally anywhere near Barnham. Someone had to carry it there on purpose, already knowing what it could do when struck against flint. The site dates to roughly 400,000 years ago, and the group living there was almost certainly an early population of Neanderthals. Overnight, the gap between having fire and making fire closed by around 350,000 years. Nick Ashton, the museum's senior curator on the project, said his team had worked the surrounding area for over 36 years of fieldwork and had never once found pyrite before this. That absence is exactly what makes the discovery convincing. If the mineral doesn't occur naturally there, and it shows up deliberately paired with fire-cracked tools at a hearth used again and again, the simplest explanation is also the most striking one. Someone understood cause and effect well enough to go get the ingredient for fire on purpose and bring it home. Even with that discovery, do the math. Berna's evidence puts fire-keeping at close to 1 million years old. Ashton and Davis's evidence puts fire-making at maybe 400,000. That still leaves something like 600,000 years, 30,000 generations, where your ancestors depended entirely on a skill with zero margin for error. Never letting the flame go out. That's not a footnote. That's the majority of the entire story of fire in human hands. Almost the whole relationship your species has had with flame was managed by people who could lose it forever in a single bad night, and knew it. You carry fire in your pocket now. A lighter, a stove igniter, a match struck without a second thought. None of it cost you vigilance. None of it cost you sleep. Somewhere back along your family line, an entire group's survival once depended on one exhausted person staying half awake at 3 a.m., watching a small orange light, refusing to look away from it, not knowing that the habit would eventually help build the brain, the language, and the species now watching this video. Fire is only the first thing your ancestors couldn't afford to lose. The next one is even harder to imagine losing, because it's not a resource at all, it's a person. That's where the next story in this series picks up.